The Wyoming wind did not merely blow, it screamed. It tore through the jagged granite teeth of the Wind River Range like a wounded beast carrying sheets of blinding white ice that scoured the bark from the ancient pines. It was the winter of 1882, a season of merciless cold that froze the marrow in a man's bones and turned the winding valley rivers to solid, unyielding iron. Up at 10,000 feet, where the air grew thin and the world felt entirely detached from the sins of civilization, Silas Thorne sat by the fire. Silas was a man carved from the same unforgiving landscape that surrounded him. His face was a map of old violence, weathered by sun and scarred by a life he had spent the last 10 years trying to forget. A thick, grizzled beard hid the worst of the marks along his jaw, but nothing could hide the profound, haunting quiet in his gray eyes. He was a trapper, a hunter, a ghost of a man who found the sheer brutality of the wilderness far more honest than the company of other men. His cabin was a fortress built against the wrath of the sky. Thick logs of Douglas fir, stripped and chinked with heavy clay, formed walls that could withstand a grizzly's assault. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of cured leather, dried sage, and the rich, heavy smoke of the massive stone hearth that dominated the far wall. An iron pot of venison stew simmered over the glowing embers, the only sound competing with the chaotic roar of the blizzard outside. Silas sat on a heavy wooden stool, his broad shoulders hunched over a work table illuminated by a single flickering oil lantern. His hands, massive and rough as tree bark, moved with practiced, delicate precision as he oiled the firing mechanism of his heavy Sharps buffalo rifle. He spoke to no one. He needed no one. The storm raging beyond his thick, shuttered windows was a blanket of absolute isolation, and Silas welcomed it. No tracker, no outlaw, no lawman would dare ride the high passes tonight. The mountain belonged only to the snow and the dead. Then came the sound. It was faint at first, easily mistaken for the crack of a frozen tree limb snapping under the weight of the ice, but it came again, a frantic, rhythmic thudding against the heavy oak of his door. Silas stopped his work. His massive hands froze over the rifle receiver. The cabin plunged into a tense, expectant silence, save for the crackle of the hearth and the relentless howling outside. No living thing belonged at his door in this weather. A lost miner would have frozen miles down the valley. A starving wolf would scratch, not knock. The pounding grew more desperate, accompanied by a muffled, high-pitched cry that was instantly swallowed by the wind. Silas's jaw tightened, the instinct to remain seated to let the mountain claim whatever foolish soul belonged to his jaws was heavy in his chest. To open the door was to invite the world back in. The cry came again, weak, fractured, and unmistakably human. He stood up his towering frame, casting a long, dancing shadow across the timbered walls. He did not rush. Silas Thorne never rushed.
Help me!
He picked up the heavy Sharps rifle, his thumb resting instinctively over the massive hammer, and walked toward the door. Stand clear! Silas's voice boomed, a deep, gravelly rumble that resonated through the thick wood. He slid the heavy iron crossbar free with a metallic scrape that set his teeth on edge. The moment he pulled the heavy latch, the blizzard violently tore the door from his grip, throwing it inward. A wall of freezing, blinding white powder blasted into the cabin, instantly extinguishing the oil lantern and sending a cascade of snow across the floorboards. Silas braced his weight against the gale, raising his arm to shield his eyes. In the swirling maelstrom of the doorway, 3 figures collapsed over the threshold, tumbling onto the rough-hewn floor like discarded rags. Silas shoved his shoulder against the oak door, fighting the sheer force of the storm, and drove it shut. He slammed the iron crossbar back into place. The sudden absence of the wind's roar left a ringing in his ears.
Hold on.
He turned the firelight, casting a warm orange glow over the desperate scene on his floor. They were native women, Apache from the look of their woven garments, which were entirely insufficient for the Wyoming high country. They were covered head to toe in a thick crust of ice and snow, trembling so violently that their teeth audibly chattered against each other. The eldest, a woman whose face bore the deep, dignified lines of immense hardship, was clutching a thin woolen blanket around the smallest of the three, a young girl no older than 12, whose lips had turned a terrifying shade of blue. The middle figure, a young woman, perhaps 17 years of age, scrambled to her knees. Despite the violent shivering that racked her slender frame, she placed herself between Silas and her family. Her dark eyes, framed by frozen strands of jet black hair, locked onto the massive mountain man. There was stark, primal fear in her gaze, but not an ounce of submission. Her hand rested on a heavy hunting knife she had drawn from her frozen sash. Silas looked down at the blade, then up at the fierce, trembling girl. He did not raise his rifle. He simply stared, his face unreadable. "We have nothing," the mother whispered. Her voice was broken raw from breathing ice. She spoke English with a halting, deliberate cadence. "No one would take us in. They shut the doors in the valley. They say we bring the sickness. Please." Silas stared at the small puddle of water beginning to form beneath the youngest girl as the cabin's heat touched the snow clinging to her clothes. He had spent 10 years carving out a life free from the burdens of other people's suffering. He knew the unwritten law of the frontier pity was a luxury that often got a man killed. He slowly lowered the barrel of the sharps, leaning the heavy weapon against the doorframe. He reached down and unbuckled the heavy gun belt at his waist, letting his twin Colt revolvers drop heavily onto a nearby wooden chest. He wanted the fierce young girl with the knife to see his empty hands. Silas turned his back to them, walking slowly toward the massive stone hearth. "Put the knife away, girl," Silas said, his voice softer now, though still carrying the rough texture of crushed stone. "Before your fingers freeze to the hilt." He reached a massive, calloused hand over the mantel and pulled down 3 thick, heavily tanned buffalo robes. He walked back to the center of the room and dropped them onto the floorboards in front of the women. "Get out of the wet clothes," Silas commanded, not looking at them as he moved toward the simmering iron pot over the fire. "Wrap up in the hides. Sit by the fire. If you stay on that floor, you'll be dead before the sun comes up." The older woman, Ciala, let out a shuddering breath, a sound that carried 1,000 miles of exhaustion. She gently pushed her oldest daughter's arm down. Kaya, the fierce one, slowly sheathed the blade, though her eyes never left the towering man as he ladled thick, steaming stew into 3 tin bowls. Silas set the bowls on the hearthstone, then retreated to the far corner of the cabin, sitting down in a high-backed wooden rocking chair. He pulled a piece of worn leather and a carving knife from his pocket, giving them the space they needed. He watched from the shadows as the women, shedding their frozen outer layers, wrapped themselves tightly in the massive, coarse buffalo hides. The heavy furs dwarfed them, swallowing their frail forms. They huddled close to the flames, their trembling hands reaching out to absorb the radiant heat. Ciala took the first bowl, testing the temperature before lifting it to the youngest girl's blue lips.
Wrap up in the
"Drink,
hides.
Nita,"
Stay
Ciala
warm.
coaxed softly
No
in her native
arguments.
tongue.
Do
"Let
it
the warmth
now."
inside. Silas continued to carve the piece of leather, the rhythmic slicing sound blending with the crackle of the dry pine logs. He did not ask their names. He did not ask why 3 Apache women were 1,000 miles north of their territories, trapped in a Wyoming blizzard. He did not ask who they were running from. In the brutal expanse of the frontier, a man only ran into a blizzard if whatever was chasing him was worse than the ice. As the color slowly began to return to little Nita's cheeks, Kaya picked up her own bowl of stew. She ate with a ravenous desperation, but her sharp obsidian eyes kept darting toward the dark corner where Silas sat. She saw the heavy scars running up his forearms. She saw the calculated, quiet way he moved, like a large predator resting in its den. "Why did you open the door?" Kaya asked, her voice raspy, slicing through the quiet of the cabin. Silas paused his carving. He looked up, the dim firelight catching the gray of his eyes. He looked at the heavy timber walls, listening to the wind screaming its frustration against the wood, furious that it had been denied its prey. "Because the mountain is cruel enough," Silas said quietly, returning to his work. eat your food. The cabin settled into a profound, heavy warmth. The storm raged outside a chaotic void of ice and death, but inside the timber walls, an unspoken truce had been forged. Silas Thorne had opened his door, and in doing so, he had unknowingly invited the entire violent world back into his life. The agonizing burn of returning blood flow is the silent, secondary cruelty of the cold. As the brutal chill began to recede from the women's bodies, the physical toll of their ordeal settled into the quiet cabin. Little Nita began to whimper, a high, reedy sound of distress, burying her face into her mother's shoulder. The feeling returning to her extremities brought with it the sensation of 1,000 heated needles driving into her flesh. Silas watched from the shadows. He set aside his leather and knife. He stood his heavy boots, making no sound on the floorboards, and walked over to a wooden water bucket near the door. He drove his knuckles down, cracking the thin layer of ice that had formed on the surface despite the ambient heat of the room. He dipped a clean, folded linen cloth into the frigid water, wringing it out until it was merely damp. He approached the hearth. Kaya instantly tensed her hand, moving instinctively beneath the heavy buffalo hide, but Silas ignored her. He knelt slowly beside Ciala, extending the damp cloth. "Don't put her close to the fire," Silas rumbled, his voice low and steady. "The heat will kill the dead flesh, make it rot. Rub her hands and feet with this. Cold water brings the blood back slow. It hurts, but it saves the fingers." Ciala looked into the trapper's gray eyes. She saw no pity, only a harsh, practical truth, born of a man who had survived the mountain's wrath many times over. She nodded gracefully, taking the cloth and beginning to gently massage Nita's pale, shivering hands. "You know the ways of the ice," Ciala murmured, her eyes focused on her daughter. "Your face, it carries the marks of the frost." Silas stood up, retreating a step. "A man lives up here long enough, the mountain leaves its brand on him, keeps him from forgetting his place." He walked over to the cast iron stove and poured himself a cup of thick, bitter coffee from a dented percolator. He took a slow sip, letting the scalding liquid burn away the lingering chill in his chest. "You've got your warmth back. You've got food. Now tell me why 3 Apache are wandering the Wind River Range in the dead of winter. The reservations are 3 weeks south of here." Ciala stopped rubbing the cloth. She looked at the dancing flames, the firelight casting deep, exhausted shadows under her eyes. "We did not wander, Silas Thorne. We were driven." Silas lowered his tin cup. He hadn't told them his name. "Men who trade in pelts and silence are known even in the low valleys," Ciala said, answering his unspoken question. "They say a man lives beneath the devil's spine who speaks to no one and misses no target. They say he came to the mountains to bury a war." "The valleys talk too much," Silas replied flatly. "Who drove you up here?" It was Kaya who answered. She threw back the edge of her buffalo robe, sitting up straight. The trembling had stopped, replaced by a rigid, defiant tension. "Amos Vance." The name hung in the warm, cedar-scented air like a sudden drop in barometric pressure. Silas's jaw tightened beneath his thick beard. He set his coffee cup down on the wooden mantel with a dull thud. Amos Vance was not merely a man, he was a plague upon the Bighorn Basin. He was a cattle baron of immense wealth and zero morality. Vance owned the grazing lands, he owned the local sheriffs, and he owned a private army of hired guns who ensured his monopoly remained absolute. To cross Amos Vance was to sign a death warrant. "Vance doesn't hunt Apache," Silas stated, his voice devoid of emotion, though his eyes sharpened. "He pushes them off his grazing land, but he doesn't waste men tracking them into a blizzard at 10,000 feet, not unless you took something from him." "They say we burned his northern grain silos," Ciala said, her voice steady, refusing to drop her gaze. "They say we stole 20 head of prime breeding horses. Vance put a bounty on us. $500 for me, 300 for my daughters, dead or alive." Silas studied them. "Did you?" "No!" Kaya spat fiercely. She reached into the thick woolen sash tied around her waist. Her frozen fingers fumbled for a moment before she produced a heavy, leather-bound satchel. She clutched it to her chest, protecting it as fiercely as her mother protected Nita. "We stole nothing. We saw something we were not meant to see." She unlatched the satchel and reached inside. She pulled out an object and placed it on the scarred wooden planks of the dining table. The metallic clink was small, but in the quiet cabin it sounded like a hammer striking an anvil. Silas stepped closer. Resting on the wood was a six-pointed silver star. It was smeared with dried blackened blood. Beside it, Kaya placed a thick, leather-bound ledger, its pages warped by moisture and cold. 3 weeks ago, we were gathering willow bark near the edges of the territorial line. Ciala explained, her voice dropping to a somber whisper. We heard the crack of rifles. We hid in the brush. We watched Amos Vance's men ride down a lone rider. They shot him from his horse, took his saddlebags, and left him in the dirt to bleed out. Silas picked up the silver star. He wiped a thumb across the blood-stained metal, revealing the deeply engraved letters, U.S. Federal Agent. His name was Thomas Miller, Ciala continued. We went to him after the riders left. He was dying. A bullet had shattered his lung, but he had hidden this ledger inside his coat where they did not look. He begged us to take it, to get it to the cavalry at Fort Washa'i. What's in the book? Silas asked, his voice a low rumble. Proof, Kaya said bitterly. Agent Miller told us before he choked on his own blood. Vance has been intercepting the government beef rations meant for the reservations. He starves our people, steals the cattle the government pays for, and resells the meat to the Army forts for double the profit. He's been doing it for years. The ledger contains the dates, the bribes, the forged signatures of the transport agents. It is the rope that will hang Amos Vance. Silas stared at the ledger. He understood now. Vance didn't care about burned silos or stolen horses. That was just to cover a legal excuse to send his hounds into the mountains. If Vance's men caught the women, they would slaughter them, burn the ledger, and the systematic starvation of the reservation would continue unchecked.
Who is tracking you? Silas asked, setting the badge down.
A man who wears a wolfskin coat, Ciala said, a flicker of genuine terror finally cracking her stoic facade. He smiles when he shoots. Cole Hackett, Silas muttered, breathing the name out like a curse. Hackett was Vance's chief enforcer, a former bounty hunter who treated killing less as a profession and more as a religion. If Hackett was on their trail, he would not stop until he had their scalps. Suddenly the cabin shuddered, but it wasn't the wind. Silas raised his head, listening intently. The relentless, deafening scream of the blizzard, the sound that had battered the log walls for 2 straight days, was fading. It didn't taper off gradually. It died with an abrupt, unnatural swiftness. Within minutes, the roaring gale was replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. The timber stopped creaking. The snow stopped lashing the window shutters. The wind is gone, Nita whispered, peering out from beneath the heavy buffalo hide. It's the eye of the storm, Silas said, turning away from the table. Or the storm has broken. He walked to the heavy oak door and unbarred the sliding wooden slat at eye level. He peered out into the darkness. The thick veil of flying snow had vanished. High above, the heavy cloud cover was fracturing, revealing the cold, pale light of a full moon. It illuminated the clearing in front of the cabin, turning the fresh 3-foot snow drifts into a landscape of ghostly, sparkling dunes. They couldn't track you in the whiteout, Silas said, sliding the slat shut and turning back to the women. The snow covered your tracks, but Hackett is a hound. He would have pushed his men to the base of the mountain before the storm hit its peak. Now that the sky is clear, he'll be cutting sign at the timberline by first light.
Ciala pulled Nita closer to her chest. We brought death to your door, Silas Thorne. We will leave before dawn. We will not ask you to die for our people's war.
Silas stood in the center of the room. He looked at his quiet, fortified life. He looked at the heavy logs he had cut with his own hands, the hearth he had built stone by stone to keep the world away. Then he looked at the blood-stained silver star on his table in the fierce, terrified eyes of a 12-year-old girl who had been condemned to freeze in the dark by greedy men. He had come to this mountain to escape the cruelty of men, but he realized with a heavy settling certainty in his chest that running from cruelty only allowed it to spread. Silas walked over to a heavy iron-bound trunk at the foot of his cot. He pulled a ring of iron keys from his pocket, unlocked the heavy padlock, and threw the lid open. Inside lay an arsenal maintained with meticulous care. He reached in and pulled out a Winchester lever-action repeating rifle. He checked the loading gate, the mechanical clack-clack of the action sounding obscenely loud in the quiet cabin. He walked over to Kaya and held the weapon out to her. "Do you know how to use this?" Silas asked. Kaya stood up, letting the buffalo robe fall from her shoulders. She took the rifle, her hands steady, and checked the chamber with a fluid, practiced motion. "I know how to kill men who want to kill me." Silas nodded grimly. He handed Ciala a heavy Smith & Wesson revolver. Finally, he strapped his twin Colt single actions back around his waist, the heavy leather settling familiarly against his hips. He picked up his massive Sharps buffalo rifle. You aren't leaving," Silas commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Up here, the snow is waist deep. Hackett would ride you down in a mile. You stay, you fight from behind the wood." Ciala looked at the heavily armed mountain man. "And what will you do?" "I'm going to teach Cole Hackett," Silas said, racking a massive half-inch lead slug into the breech of the Sharps, "that some doors should never be knocked on." Dawn broke over the Wind River Range, not with warmth, but with a brilliant, blinding clarity that felt like a blade against the eyes. The storm had passed entirely, leaving in its wake a world buried beneath 3 feet of pristine, untouched powder. The snow sparkled like crushed diamonds beneath the pale morning sun, but the temperature had plummeted even further in the clear air. It was the kind of cold that froze the sap in the pine trees until the trunks split open with loud, echoing cracks that sounded like rifle fire. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned down to a mound of glowing cherry-red embers. Silas Thorne had not slept. He sat by the hearth in his heavy canvas coat, his broad back resting against the stone, the massive Sharps rifle lying across his knees. He had spent the remaining hours of the night listening to the agonizing creak of the roof timbers and waiting for the inevitable. Ciala and her daughters still slept huddled together beneath the mountain of buffalo hides. For a moment, Silas just watched them. He saw the gentle rise and fall of little Nita's breathing. He thought of the sheer cruelty of a world that would send heavily armed men into a blizzard to murder a child over a ledger of stolen beef. Suddenly, Silas's gaze shifted to the small, thick-glassed window facing the valley. He couldn't see anything through the frost-rimed pane, but he didn't need to. He felt it, a subtle shift in the absolute stillness of the mountain. Down in the lower timber, the blue jays, the few birds foolish enough to winter at this altitude, had abruptly stopped calling. Silas stood up. His joints popped in the cold air, but his movements were terrifyingly swift. "Wake up," Silas said, his voice a low, urgent rumble that instantly cut through the silence. Ciala's eyes snapped open. She did not gasp or cry out. A lifetime of surviving on the edge of a knife had trained her to wake in a state of absolute readiness. She immediately placed a hand over Nita's mouth to keep the child quiet as she roused her. Kaya was on her feet a second later, her hands instinctively wrapping around the cold steel of the Winchester repeating rifle Silas had given her. "They are here," Kaya asked, her breath pluming in the chilly air of the cabin. "They're moving through the blue spruce thicket 200 yards down the slope," Silas replied, walking to the heavy oak door. He checked the iron crossbar, ensuring it was seated deep within its iron brackets. "The snow is slowing their horses, but they found the trail." He moved to the center of the room, pulling a heavy woven rug aside to reveal a trapdoor set flush into the floorboards. He hauled the thick iron ring upward, exposing a dark earthen root cellar below. It was cramped, smelling of damp soil and preserved root vegetables, but its walls were solid dirt and stone. "Get the little one down there," Silas ordered, looking directly at Ciala. "Keep her in the far corner behind the apple crates. Bullets can punch through these log walls if they hit the chinking. Down there, she's beneath the firing line." Ciala did not argue. She hurried Nita down the wooden ladder, whispering reassurances in Apache. She climbed back up, gripping the heavy Smith & Wesson revolver, her face set in a mask of grim determination. "I fight," Ciala said simply. Silas gave a single curt nod. He pointed Kaya toward the window. "Stand to the side of the frame. Don't press your face to the glass. If they shoot, the splinters will blind you. Wait for my mark." A booming voice suddenly echoed across the snowy clearing outside, shattering the crisp morning silence. "Hello, the cabin." Silas stepped to the door and slid back the narrow horizontal firing slat. He peered out. 4 men sat atop large steam-breathing horses at the edge of the tree line. The animals were exhausted, their chests heaving, their coats caked with frozen sweat and snow. The men did not look much better, but their rifles were drawn. In the lead was a man wearing a massive gray wolfskin coat, the pelt draped over his shoulders like a macabre mantle, the hollowed-out head of the wolf resting against his collar. This was Cole Hackett. His face was a map of cruel, deeply etched lines half hidden beneath the brim of a snow-covered Stetson. He rested a Winchester lazily across his saddle pommel, a lit cigarillo clamped between his teeth, defying the bitter cold. Flanking him were 3 hired guns, rough men with desperate eyes. Silas recognized 2 of them from his rare trips to the lowland trading posts, a nervous man named O'Bannon and a wiry rat-faced tracker named Jessup.
State your business, Hackett, Silas yelled back through the slit, his deep voice carrying easily over the snow drifts. You're trespassing on my claim.
Hackett chuckled, a harsh grating sound that held no humor. He spurred his tired horse a few paces closer to the cabin, stopping just out of easy pistol range. Morning, Silas. Didn't expect to find you playing host this far up the rock, Hackett called out smoothly. We're tracking 3 runaway squaws. Stole a fair bit of property from Mr. Vance down in the basin, burned a silo too. We tracked them right to the base of this ridge before the snow covered the tracks. Hackett paused, taking a slow drag from his cigarillo. You seen him? It's a mighty cold night for a man to be sleeping alone. I haven't seen a soul in 3 weeks, Silas lied effortlessly, his voice a flat, unyielding wall. Just me and the pines up here. You boys turn your horses around before they freeze to the ground. You got a long ride back to the valley. Hackett's easy smile vanished, replaced by a cold, reptilian stare. He gestured to the wiry tracker beside him. Now, Silas, don't take me for a fool. Jessup here has a nose like a bloodhound. Says he smells wood smoke and wet wool on the updraft. Now I know you make your own clothes out of buckskin. You ain't wearing wool. Hackett leaned forward in his saddle. Hand them over. There's a hefty bounty, and Mr. Vance is willing to split it with you for your cooperation. $500 buys a lot of peace and quiet, Silas. Don't throw your life away for 3 thieving Indians who wouldn't spit on you if you were on fire. Inside the cabin, Kaya's grip tightened on the Winchester. She looked at Silas, waiting for the mountain man to turn around to point his heavy guns at them and demand they leave. $500 was a fortune. It was enough to buy a ranch of his own. But Silas Thorne did not even blink. He slid the massive octagonal barrel of the Sharps buffalo rifle through the firing slit. The metallic scrape of the iron sights against the wood was loud enough to reach the men outside. Yeah, I told you there's no one here, Silas warned, his voice dropping an octave, resonating with lethal promise. Take one more step toward this porch, Hackett, and I'll put a .50 caliber slug clean through your chest. It'll leave a hole big enough for a barn owl to fly through. I won't warn you twice. The 3 hired guns instantly raised their rifles. The mechanical clacking of hammers being cocked cut sharply through the quiet mountain air. You're making a mistake, old man. Hackett spat his face, flushing red with sudden violent anger. You can't hold all 4 of us, not for this. Beside Hackett, the hired gun named O'Bannon lowered his rifle a fraction of an inch. He looked at the thick, fortified logs of the cabin, the heavy iron-reinforced door, and the massive barrel of the buffalo rifle aimed squarely at them. He knew the legends of Silas Thorne. Hackett, this is madness, O'Bannon shouted over the freezing wind, his horse dancing nervously beneath him. You said they were just runaways. That old man is Silas Thorne, and he's dug in like a tick. If he's defending them, we ain't walking away from this without losing half our number. It ain't worth Vance's money. Hackett turned his head slowly. The bounty hunter had long crossed the line between the law and outright butchery. Vance paid him to leave no loose ends, and O'Bannon was quickly becoming a frayed thread, mutiny. Even the suggestion of it was a contagion Hackett refused to tolerate. I said we're taking the cabin, O'Bannon, Hackett hissed, his voice dropping to a terrifying purr. I ain't dying for Vance's stolen beef, O'Bannon yelled, lowering his rifle entirely and turning his horse's head, preparing to ride back down the trail. The cruelty of Cole Hackett was absolute. He didn't hesitate. He didn't blink. He simply drew his heavy Colt revolver from his hip in a blur of motion and pulled the trigger. The gunshot was deafening. The bullet struck O'Bannon squarely in the side of the chest, punching through his heavy coat. The hired gun let out a choked gasp, dropping his rifle into the deep snow as he tumbled backward out of his saddle. He hit the ground with a dull thud, his blood instantly painting a bright, shocking crimson stain across the pristine white powder. Inside the cabin, Ciala gasped, taking a step backward. Kaya's eyes widened in horror. Even in the brutal Apache wars, a commander did not butcher his own men so callously. Silas merely gritted his teeth. "He just killed his own man," the trapper muttered. "He isn't leaving here without that ledger, even if he has to burn the mountain down."
"Suppress the cabin!" Hackett roared, turning his smoking revolver toward the thick oak door. "Riddle the place!"
The tree line erupted in flashes of muzzle fire. Heavy lead slugs tore through the air, chewing into the thick oak door and burying themselves deep into the Douglas fir logs with sickening thuds. A stray bullet caught the corner of the small window, shattering the thick glass inward. Shards of ice and glass sprayed across the room, raining down on the wooden floor. "Keep your heads down," Silas roared over the deafening mechanical clatter of lever-action rifles. He didn't flinch. He sighted down the heavy barrel of the Sharps, aiming not at Hackett, who had immediately spurred his horse behind a massive, snow-covered boulder, but at the hired gun named Jessup. Silas squeezed the trigger. The roar of the buffalo rifle was apocalyptic. It sounded like a cannon going off inside the confined space of the cabin, shaking the dust from the rafters. A massive plume of gray smoke blasted out of the firing slit. Outside, the .50 caliber slug tore across the clearing. It missed Jessup by mere inches, but struck the thick trunk of the pine tree the tracker was using for cover. The sheer kinetic force of the massive bullet shattered the frozen wood, sending a lethal spray of jagged foot-long splinters tearing into Jessup's shoulder and cheek. The tracker screamed, dropping his rifle and falling backward into a snowbank, clutching his mangled face. Kaya did not wait for further instruction. Through the shattered window pane, she tracked the muzzle flashes of the remaining hired gun. She raised the Winchester to her shoulder, exhaled a slow, steady breath of condensing air, and squeezed the trigger twice in rapid succession. Her shots were true. One bullet sparked off a rock near the gunman's head, forcing him to dive into a deep snowdrift for cover, completely pinning him down. The siege of the high cabin had begun. The howling void of the blizzard had been replaced by the roaring thunder of gunfire, and the pristine mountain snow was about to be drowned in blood. The shootout settled into a brutal, deafening rhythm. The sheer mass of the Douglas fir logs absorbed the hired gun's rifle fire with dull, heavy thuds, but the continuous barrage was slowly chewing the cabin's facade to splinters. Acrid blue smoke from black powder hung thick in the freezing air, stinging the eyes and coating the back of the throat with the taste of sulfur and lead. Silas Thorne moved with a terrifying mechanical efficiency. He knelt by the firing slit, the massive breech of the Sharp's rifle snapping open to eject a smoking brass cartridge the size of a man's thumb. He fed another heavy half-inch slug into the chamber, locked it shut, and fired. The buffalo rifle roared, shaking the dust from the rafters. A heavy branch on the pine tree sheltering one of the gunmen sheared off, completely burying the man under a cascade of heavy snow and sharp needles. To Silas's left, Kaya was a ghost at the shattered window. She did not waste ammunition. She waited until a muzzle flash illuminated the dark timber, took a steady breath of the freezing air pouring through the broken glass, and squeezed the trigger of the Winchester. The lever action clacked sharply as she chambered another round. She had tied a piece of ripped canvas around her lower face to keep the biting frostbite at bay, her dark eyes entirely focused, entirely lethal. Outside, pinned behind the massive granite boulder, Cole Hackett was losing his patience. He had expected a swift, brutal execution. He had not expected a fortified bunker defended by a seasoned frontiersman and a girl who shot like an army marksman. Jessup was bleeding out in the snow, his face mangled by wood shrapnel. The remaining hired gun was entirely suppressed, too terrified to raise his head above the snowdrifts. Hackett pulled his pocket watch from his heavy coat. The sun was climbing. In a few hours, the severe cold would begin to break the firing pins on their rifles, and their horses would freeze where they stood. He needed to end this. He needed the ledger. "You're a stubborn fool, Thorne." Hackett's voice echoed across the clearing, laced with a venomous, manic edge. "You think wood and mud are going to save you? You think I won't burn you out like rats?" Inside the cabin, Silas paused his reloading. He looked up at the ceiling. The roof was constructed of heavy cedar shingles layered over thick pine boards. During the summer, it was impregnable, but now, after months of extreme cold, drying out the wood beneath the snow, and the heavy draft of the massive stone chimney pulling air upward, it was vulnerable. "Kaya, get back from the window," Silas commanded sharply. "Get down." Hackett did not reach for a torch. He reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a thick, tightly wrapped bundle of mining dynamite. He had brought it to blast through the frozen earth to bury the women, but it would serve a far more destructive purpose now. He lashed a pitch-soaked rag around the heavy waxy sticks and struck a lucifer match against the rough granite boulder. The rag caught fire, instantly burning with a fierce, unnatural heat. With a guttural yell, Hackett stepped out from behind the boulder, his arm whipping forward in a high, arcing throw. The bundle sailed through the crisp morning air, leaving a trailing ribbon of black smoke against the pale blue sky. It landed squarely on the sloped roof of the cabin, lodging securely against the base of the stone chimney. Silas heard the heavy thud on the shingles directly above his head. He recognized the violent sputtering hiss of the fuse immediately. "Sell her now," Silas roared, dropping the sharps and lunging toward the center of the room. He grabbed Kaya by the collar of her canvas coat, hauling her away from the window just as the dynamite detonated. The explosion was apocalyptic. It did not merely shake the cabin, it ruptured reality. A blinding flash of kinetic energy tore downward, shattering the heavy pine support beams as if they were dry twigs. The concussive wave hit the floorboards, throwing Silas and Kaya violently against the far wall. The heavy iron stove tipped over, spilling a cascade of glowing red coals across the dry wooden planks. A massive, jagged hole was blown entirely through the roof. The sky became visible through the splintered, jagged teeth of broken cedar. For a fraction of a second, the cold air rushed in, but it was immediately followed by a torrential rain of burning debris, blazing shingles, and flaming pitch. The spilled coals from the stove ignited the shattered floorboards instantly. The dry, bare rugs caught fire, sending a massive wall of flames surging up the back wall toward the loft. Thick, impenetrable black smoke immediately billowed into the confined space, choking the remaining oxygen and reducing visibility to mere inches. Silas pushed himself off the floor, his ears ringing with a high, agonizing whine. Blood trickled down the side of his face. From a deep gash on his forehead where flying timber had struck him, he coughed violently, the toxic smoke searing his lungs. He crawled through the rising heat, his hands searching blindly across the floorboards until he found the heavy iron ring of the trap door. He hauled it open. "Ciala!" Silas yelled, his voice cracking from the smoke. Ciala appeared at the bottom of the ladder, her face completely pale, clutching a terrified, weeping Nita to her chest. The earthen walls of the cellar had protected them from the blast, but the smoke was already pouring down into the hole like water, filling a sinking ship. "Bring her up, hurry!" Silas barked, reaching down to grab the little girl's arm, hauling her up into the burning room. Ciala scrambled up right behind her. "The roof is gone!" Kaya shouted over the roaring sound of the flames, dragging her Winchester with her as she stumbled toward them. "The door is burning. We cannot go out." Outside, the crack of Hackett's rifle sounded again. A bullet tore through the burning oak door, narrowly missing Ciala. Hackett was laying down, suppressing fire, waiting for them to be driven out by the flames directly into his crosshairs. "We aren't going out the front," Silas said grimly. He grabbed his Sharps rifle from where it had fallen, then shoved the women back toward the open trapdoor. "Down, all of you, now!" The heat in the cabin was becoming unendurable, a physical weight that pressed against their skin and singed the hair on their arms. The main support beam of the roof groaned in agony, consumed by fire, ready to collapse entirely. Silas grabbed a heavy canvas sack containing extra ammunition and pushed Ciala down the ladder, following her into the cramped, dark root cellar. He reached up, grabbed the heavy iron ring, and pulled the trap door shut above them, sealing them in absolute darkness. The sudden absence of the roaring fire was jarring, but the heat radiating from the floorboards above them was terrifying. It turned the small cellar into an oven. Nita was sobbing uncontrollably, her small hands clinging to her mother's dress. Silas struck a match, the sudden flare illuminating the cramped, dirt-walled space. The air was already growing thin. He moved swiftly to the back wall of the cellar, where stacks of heavy wooden crates holding preserved apples and root vegetables were piled high against the dirt. He threw his massive shoulder against the crates, shoving them aside with a desperate brute force. They toppled over, spilling frozen potatoes and glass jars across the dirt floor. Behind the crates was not a wall of earth, but a heavy wooden bulkhead reinforced with iron bands.
What is this? Ciala asked, coughing as the smoke began to seep through the cracks in the ceiling above.
Old silver prospectors at it, Silas grunted, pulling a heavy iron crowbar from beneath a sack of flour. He jammed the flat edge of the iron beneath the bulkhead and threw his weight against it. I found it when I was digging the foundation for the cabin. It cuts straight through the bedrock of the ridge, comes out 300 yards up the pass directly beneath a rock formation called the Devil's Spine. The timber cracked and the bulkhead swung open, revealing a dark, narrow tunnel carved entirely out of solid granite. It smelled of ancient, freezing dampness, a sharp contrast to the suffocating smoke filling the cellar. "Go," Silas ordered, lighting a small kerosene lantern and shoving it into Kaya's hands. "You lead. Keep your head down. The ceiling is low. Don't stop until you feel the wind." Kaya took the lantern, her eyes meeting Silas's for a brief, intense second. She nodded, turning and ducking into the dark maw of the tunnel. Ciala followed, pulling Nita by the hand, whispering urgent prayers in Apache. Silas did not immediately follow. He stood at the entrance of the tunnel, looking back up at the heavy wooden ceiling of the root cellar. He could hear the structure of his home, the sanctuary he had built with his bare hands to keep the cruelty of the world at bay, failing. The roar of the fire above was deafening. The wood was screaming. He had come to this mountain to fade away into nothing. But as he watched the backs of the three women disappearing into the dark earth, fleeing with the evidence that could save thousands of their people, he realized that a man's home wasn't the wood he stacked. It was the line he was willing to draw in the dirt. A massive earth-shattering crash echoed from above. The main roof beam had finally failed. Thousands of pounds of burning cedar stone and heavy snow collapsed entirely into the main room of the cabin. The impact shattered the trapdoor above Silas, sending a shower of burning splinters and glowing red embers raining down into the cellar. Silas stepped backwards into the cold granite tunnel. He grabbed the heavy wooden bulkhead and pulled it shut behind him, dropping a thick iron latch into place. The fire was sealed away, replaced by the absolute crushing darkness of the earth. The air in the tunnel was freezing, carrying the sharp, metallic tang of unmined ore. Silas turned and began to walk, his heavy boots echoing off the tight stone walls, following the faint, flickering glow of Kaya's lantern ahead of him. Above them, the mountain wind howled in triumph as it consumed the ashes of Silas Thorne's past. Below the earth, the scarred trapper moved forward in the dark, leading the hunted toward the light, preparing to make his final stand. The air inside the prospector's audit grew steadily colder, losing the damp, heavy scent of subterranean earth and replacing it with the sterile, razor-sharp edge of the high-altitude freeze. They walked in silence, guided only by the sputtering yellow flame of the kerosene lantern Kaya held aloft. The tunnel angled sharply upward, a grueling incline that forced their burning lungs to fight for every breath of the thinning oxygen. After what felt like hours of suffocating darkness, the lantern flickered violently as a sudden aggressive draft swept down the shaft. Silas stepped ahead of Kaya. He holstered a Colt, bracing his massive shoulder against a set of heavy, frost-welded timber doors blocking their path. "Stand back!" Silas rasped, his voice raw from the smoke they had inhaled. He threw his entire weight against the wood. The frozen hinges screamed in protest, shedding a shower of crystalline ice before giving way completely. They stumbled out into a world of blinding, overwhelming white. The transition from the pitch-black tunnel to the pristine glare of the high mountain sun was physically painful. Silas squinted, raising a hand to shield his eyes. They had emerged 300 yards above the cabin onto a treacherous, wind-scoured ridge known to the local trappers as the Devil's Spine. It was a narrow shelf of granite that clung to the side of the peak, dropping off into a sheer 500-foot abyss on their right. To their left, a massive vertical cliff face rose into the heavens, crowned by thousands of tons of overhanging wind-packed snow. Below them, a thick, greasy pillar of black smoke spiraled upward into the pale blue sky, the funeral pyre of Silas Thorne's sanctuary. There was no time to mourn the loss of the cabin. The temperature on the exposed ridge was brutally low, the wind cutting through their sweat-dampened clothes like a rusted blade. Silas looked down at little Nita. The 12-year-old was shivering violently again, her legs buckling beneath the hem of the heavy buffalo hide. She had nothing left to give. Silas didn't say a word. He slung his massive Sharps rifle over his shoulder by its leather strap, stepped forward, and scooped the young girl up in his arms. He held her against his chest, transferring his own body heat to her trembling frame. "We keep moving," Silas ordered, his breath pluming in thick clouds. "The snow here is waist deep. Step exactly in my tracks. It will save your strength." Ciala looked at the scarred giant carrying her child, her eyes shining with an exhaustion that went bone deep. "You cannot carry her and fight Silas Thorne." "I won't have to if we make the tree line on the far side of the pass," Silas grunted, turning his back to the wind and beginning the grueling task of breaking trail. Every step was an agonizing battle against the elements. The powder was impossibly deep, acting like a freezing vice around their thighs. Silas moved with the slow, unstoppable momentum of a glacier, his massive legs carving a trench through the snow. Kaya walked directly behind him, her dark eyes constantly scanning the ridge behind them, her frost-bitten fingers gripping the Winchester so tightly her knuckles were white. They made it perhaps 200 yards across the exposed face of the Devil's Spine when the crack of a rifle shattered the thin air. It wasn't a warning shot. A heavy-lid slug skipped off the granite wall mere inches from Silas's head, showering him with sharp shards of rock. He instantly threw his weight forward, tackling Ciala into a deep snowdrift and shielding Nita with his own body. "Down!" Silas roared. Kaya dropped to her stomach, sliding to the very edge of the precipice, and peered back the way they had come. Emerging from the dark maw of the tunnel entrance, looking like demons spat out of hell, were Cole Hackett and his tracker Jessup. Jessup's face was a horrific mess of blood and hastily tied bandages, but his one good eye was fixed squarely on them, his rifle raised. Hackett stepped out beside him, his wolfskin coat singed by the fire, a manic, obsessive rage twisting his features. They had figured out the tunnel's existence the moment the cabin collapsed inward without a trace of human remains. "You can't run, Thorne," Hackett's voice carried over the howling wind, dripping with malicious triumph. "The mountains got nowhere left for you to hide." "They have the high ground," Kaya shouted to Silas, chambering around into her Winchester. "They will pick us off if we try to cross the rest of the open ridge." Silas knew she was right. He looked ahead. The safety of the dense timber was still 100 yards away. In this deep snow, they were moving targets. He looked down at Nita, then up at Ciala's terrified face. He had brought them this far. He would not let Amos Vance win. Take her," Silas said gently, placing Nita into Ciala's arms. He unbuttoned his heavy canvas and wool coat, shrugging it off his massive shoulders. He draped the thick garment over Ciala and the child. The biting cold immediately bit into his linen shirt, but Silas barely felt it. He reached into the coat's deep pocket and pulled out the blood-stained silver badge and the leather-bound ledger. He pressed them firmly into Kaya's hands.
Take the evidence. Get to the timberline. Do not stop until you reach Fort Washakie, Silas commanded, his gray eyes locking onto the young warriors. We are not leaving you, Kaya protested fiercely, her voice cracking. You gave up your home for us?
And if you die on this ridge, Agent Miller died for nothing and Vance keeps starving your people, Silas replied, his voice dropping to a low, authoritative rumble that demanded obedience. I know this mountain. I know how to bleed it. You go now. Ciala reached out, her trembling hand touching Silas's scarred cheek. It was a fleeting, desperate gesture of profound gratitude. The spirits of the ice will remember your name, Silas Thorne. Go, Silas whispered. As Ciala and Kaya scrambled forward, crawling through the trench Silas had carved to stay below the firing line, the mountain man turned to face the hunters. He dragged himself behind a jagged outcropping of dark granite, resting the heavy barrel of the Sharp's buffalo rifle over the stone. He sighted down the barrel, exhaled slowly, and pulled the trigger. The heavy slug tore across the distance, striking the rock directly at Hackett's feet and throwing a shower of stone splinters into the bounty hunter's legs. Hackett cursed violently, diving back toward the cover of the tunnel entrance. But Jessup, driven by pain and vengeance, didn't seek cover. The tracker stood in the open, leveled his rifle, and fired rapidly. The first bullet missed. The second tore cleanly through the fleshy part of Silas's left thigh. Silas grunted a hot, searing agony exploding down his leg. He collapsed behind the granite outcropping, gritting his teeth to keep from screaming. Bright, steaming, crimson arterial blood began to instantly pool in the pristine snow beneath him. He grabbed his leather belt, yanked it free, and strapped it brutally tight around his upper thigh, stemming the worst of the bleeding. He was pinned down, severely wounded, and outgunned. Through the ringing in his ears, he could hear Hackett and Jessup laughing. They had seen him fall. They knew he was hit. I'm going to take my time with you, Thorne, Hackett yelled, stepping out from cover, slowly closing the distance. And when I'm done with you, I'm going to track down those squaws and finish the job. Silas leaned his head back against the freezing stone. He had only 2 rounds left for the Sharps. He couldn't shoot them both before they closed the distance. But Silas had not survived a decade in the harshest territory on Earth by relying solely on lead. He looked straight up. Hanging hundreds of feet above the narrow trail directly over the path Hackett and Jessup were currently walking was the cornice. It was a monstrous, unstable overhang of packed snow and ice built up by a week of relentless blizzards. It weighed thousands of tons, clinging precipitously to the cliff face. It was a loaded spring waiting for the slightest shock to release its kinetic fury. Silas reached into his heavy canvas satchel. His bloody, trembling fingers bypassed the extra cartridges and found what he was looking for: a half-pound bundle of blasting powder complete with a short 3-second waterproof fuse. He used it for clearing massive pine stumps. Today, he would use it to clear the mountain. Hackett and Jessup were 50 yards away, now their rifles raised, moving confidently for the kill. Silas struck a lucifer match against the dry side of the granite rock. He touched the flame to the fuse. It immediately began to hiss, violently spitting a trail of angry, white-hot sparks. Silas didn't throw the explosive at the men. With a guttural roar pushing through the agonizing pain in his leg, he stood up from behind the rock. With every ounce of remaining strength in his right arm, he hurled the spitting bundle of dynamite straight up into the air, aiming directly for the center of the massive snow overhang. What in the hell? Jessup muttered, pausing his advance to look up at the small black object arcing against the bright blue sky. The detonation was not a mere explosion. It was the hammer of God striking the anvil of the earth. The concussive shockwave hit the cliff face with devastating force. For a single suspended heartbeat, there was absolute silence. Then a deep, terrifying groan vibrated through the very bedrock of the devil's spine. A jagged fracture line hundreds of feet long suddenly appeared across the crest of the snowpack. The entire cornice detached. It began as a slow cascade, a crumbling edge of white. but within 2 seconds it transformed into an apocalyptic, roaring tidal wave of absolute annihilation. Millions of tons of snow, solid ice, and sheer kinetic terror plummeted down the face of the cliff. Hackett's face contorted into a mask of pure, screaming terror. He turned to run, but there was nowhere to go. The mountain had fallen on him.
The avalanche hit the narrow ridge with the force of a derailing locomotive. It completely engulfed Hackett and Jessup, sweeping them off their feet and instantly burying them beneath a suffocating, freezing tomb before throwing them entirely over the precipice into the 500-foot abyss below.
Silas threw himself backward, wedging his massive body as deeply as he could beneath the slight undercut of his granite outcropping. The edge of the white tsunami roared past him close enough that the sheer wind force of it tore the hat from his head and buried his legs beneath 3 feet of packed concrete-like snow. The roar continued for what felt like an eternity, a deafening drumbeat of destruction. And then as suddenly as it had begun, the mountain went silent.
Silas lay on his back, gasping for air, the cold finally beginning to numb the searing pain in his leg. He looked up at the sky. The overhang was gone, leaving only a sheer, clean face of gray rock. The ridge where Cole Hackett and his tracker had stood was wiped entirely clean.
The scarred mountain man let his head fall back into the snow, closing his eyes as the creeping darkness of blood loss finally began to pull him under. He had held the line. The cold is a merciful thief. It steals the pain first, replacing the fiery agony of a gunshot wound with a heavy spreading numbness. Then it steals the senses, narrowing the world down to the slow fading rhythm of a slowing heartbeat. Silas Thorne lay beneath the dusting of snow, his eyes half closed, watching the gray clouds gather over the jagged peaks. He had drawn his line in the dirt. He had held it. Now the mountain was quietly calling him back to the earth. It was a peaceful way to die, far removed from the greed and violence of men. He closed his eyes, surrendering to the creeping dark. "Do not close your eyes, Silas Thorne." The voice was fierce, cracking with exhaustion and defiance. Silas's eyes fluttered open. Hovering over him, blocking out the pale sky, was Kaya. Her dark hair was wildly windblown, her face flushed with the biting cold. She had not run to the timberline. She had come back for him. Right behind her was Ciala, carrying Nita on her back. Ciala fell to her knees beside the scarred mountain man. She immediately pulled the heavy buffalo hide from her own shoulders and draped it over Silas's shivering chest. "I gave you an order?" Silas rasped, his voice barely a whisper, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "I told you to go." "Apache do not abandon their wounded," Kaya stated fiercely. She reached down her small hands, gripping the collar of his heavy canvas coat, and pulled with a strength born of pure, desperate adrenaline. "Get up! You do not get to die here after forcing us to live." Ciala quickly unraveled a long strip of woven wool from her sash. She bound it tightly over Silas's blood-soaked leather belt, creating a secondary tourniquet over his shattered thigh. The pressure brought a sudden blinding spike of pain that cut through the numbness, snapping Silas fully awake. He groaned, his massive hands digging into the snow. "Lean on me," Kaya commanded. She slung his massive Sharps rifle over her own shoulder, taking on the weight of his iron along with her Winchester. Silas looked at the fiercely loyal young woman, then at Ciala, whose eyes held a deep, unyielding strength. For 10 years, he had believed that to let anyone close was to invite destruction. He had pushed the world away to survive. But as Kaya drove her shoulder under his armpit, bracing his massive lumbering weight against her slender frame, Silas realized the profound truth of the frontier. A man alone is just waiting to die. Survival is something you do together. "All right," Silas grunted, fighting through the agonizing pain as he hauled himself upright, his massive arm wrapping around Kaya's shoulders. "Let's walk." The descent from the Devil's Spine was a grueling, agonizing purgatory. It took them 4 days to cross the 40 miles of treacherous, snow-choked high country down to the lower basin. They moved at an agonizingly slow pace. Silas used a thick, sturdy branch of mountain ash as a crutch, leaning heavily on Kaya when his leg gave out. Ciala led the way, foraging for frozen pine nuts in melting snow over small, hidden smokeless fires to keep them hydrated. They did not speak much. They didn't need to. In the vast, howling emptiness of the wilderness, they had become a single, breathing organism bound by blood ice and a sheer stubborn refusal to let the other die. Silas, the broken man who had built a fortress to keep people out, found his true shelter in the protective circle of 3 hunted Apache women. On the afternoon of the 5th day, the heavy, iron-studded gates of Fort Washakie loomed through the freezing mist of the valley floor. The sentries on the parapets lowered their rifles in sheer bewilderment as the battered procession emerged from the tree line. Silas looked more like a ghost than a man, his face pale and gaunt, his beard matted with dried blood, leaning heavily on a crude crutch, and a fiercely protective Apache girl who carried 2 rifles with the ease of a seasoned soldier. 10 minutes later, the heavy mahogany doors of the commandant's office swung open. Captain James Monroe, a stern but honorable cavalry officer known for his meticulous recording of frontier injustices, sat behind his desk. He stood up abruptly as the fort's guards escorted the group inside. The warmth of the pot-belly stove in the corner hit them like a physical wave. Silas stood tall, refusing the chair a young corporal offered him. He looked at Ciala and nodded. Ciala stepped forward. With quiet, unshakable dignity, she unlatched her leather satchel. She placed the blood-stained silver badge of Agent Thomas Miller directly onto the polished wood of the captain's desk. Beside it, she laid the warped, moisture-damaged leather ledger. "Where did you get this?" Captain Monroe asked quietly, picking up the heavy silver star, his eyes widening as he recognized the federal stamp. From a dead man?" Silas grunted, his voice a low, exhausted rumble. "And it cost me my home to bring it to you. Amos Vance murdered the agent. He's been stealing your beef rations, starving the reservations, and selling the cattle back to you. The proof is in the book. Do your job, Captain." Captain Monroe slowly opened the ledger. As his eyes scanned the handwritten columns detailing the massive embezzlement, the forged transport documents, and the bribery of territorial judges, his expression hardened into cold, military fury. Amos Vance had not just robbed the Apache, he had defrauded the United States Army. Monroe looked up, his eyes softening with deep respect as he looked at Sialakaya and little Nita. "You have done a great service to your people and to the law. You will be granted safe harbor here at the fort. No man will touch you." He then looked at the scarred trapper. "And you, Thorne, the fort surgeon will tend to that leg. You look like hell."
"I felt worse," Silas muttered before his vision finally swam and the massive trapper collapsed onto the wooden floorboards.
The wheels of justice on the frontier turn slowly, but the weight of federal wrath is absolute. Armed with Agent Miller's ledger, Captain Monroe wired the U.S. Marshals in Cheyenne. Within a week, Amos Vance's sprawling cattle empire was dismantled. Vance was arrested by a contingent of heavily armed cavalrymen, stripped of his lands, and sent back east to face federal hanging. The starvation of the reservations ended, replaced by direct military oversight of the rations. It was mid-spring when Silas Thorne finally walked out of the fort's infirmary without a crutch. He still walked with a heavy limp, a permanent reminder of the devil's spine, but the harsh, haunted emptiness in his gray eyes was gone. He stood near the edge of the fort's parade ground, watching the snowmelt swell the nearby river, preparing to pack his mules. He had no cabin to return to. The mountain was empty.
"You are leaving."
Silas turned. Ciala stood behind him, bathed in the warm spring sunlight. Nita was peeking out from behind her mother's skirt, holding a small wooden carved horse Silas had whittled for her during his recovery. Kaya stood a few paces back, her dark eyes entirely unreadable. "I am a mountain man, Ciala," Silas said softly, adjusting the leather strap of his saddlebag. "Timber is all I know. I have to go build a new roof before the first snow flies." "A man builds a roof to keep the storm out," Kaya said, stepping forward. "But a home is built to keep your family warm." Silas stopped. He looked at the fierce young woman who had carried him through the valley of death. He looked at Ciala, whose gentle hands had pulled him back from the edge of the dark. He had lost everything he owned in that fire, But looking at them, Silas realized he had gained the only thing he had ever truly needed. The Bighorn Basin has good timber, Silas said slowly, a faint, rare smile touching the corners of his scarred mouth. Lots of game, but it's a lot of work for one man to build a cabin big enough for four. Ciala's eyes crinkled with profound warmth. She placed a hand over her heart, a gesture of absolute eternal loyalty. We know how to build, Silas Thorne, and we know how to survive. Silas nodded. He didn't need to say anything else. He reached down, hoisted little Nita up onto the back of his pack mule and handed Kaya the reins. Together, the scarred survivor and the women he had refused to let die turned their backs on the fort and walked out into the vast, beautiful frontier. They were not hunted anymore. They were just going home,